if your pelvic floor is used to doing whatever it's doing, it's not going to say, I'm doing something unusual, because it's doing what it usually does. And it's not going to let you know. It doesn't know.
Hello and welcome to the Be Well Baby podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Emily Spade.
I'm so excited to bring you Laura Luitje today. Laura has been my pelvic floor physical therapist through multiple babies, and honestly, I've learned so much from her, not just clinically, but in how she approaches bodies, movement, and wellness. And what's wild is that our interests and similarities overlap in the most unexpected ways. We are both fluent in French, although Laura is also fluent in Spanish, which I wish I could say, but I am not. We both started our careers as yoga teachers, and we share this deep belief that the body wants to work well when we give it what it needs. And we're both pelvic floor physical therapists. So Laura is a pelvic health physical therapist who has this incredible gift for demystifying how our bodies work. Everything from pain and elimination to reproduction, movement, and joy. What I love about working with her is that she doesn't isolate the pelvic floor as this separate thing that needs to be treated. She looks at the whole system, which is how I look at the body. Your nervous system, your brain, your feet, your ribs, everything. She integrates it all. She's also a former dancer, a circus arts enthusiast, has twins, and has done her own deep work with a really severe diastasis, which means she gets it. She gets what it's like to be a parent trying to find wellness in a very busy life. So stick around to bear witness to me making a wild realization about how I parent and how I might want to parent differently, and find out why your pelvic floor problem might not actually be a pelvic floor problem. Let's welcome Laura.
All right, Laura, thank you so much for being here. It is such a pleasure to talk to you, and I'm really excited for what we're going to talk about today. Well, why don't we start with you have such a rich background as a dancer, a yoga teacher, and pelvic floor PT. How do you feel like those paths kind of shaped the way that you look at the body?
Yeah. When I was thinking this over, I was thinking, when I was in my 20s, I would have told you that I knew a lot about my own body because I did dance and yoga and Pilates. And it was only through going through experiences like a twin pregnancy and having injuries myself that I realized I had a relationship with my body, but you sort of don't know what your habits are because they're innate. They're like worked in there unconsciously. So I think that actually those physical experiences that I had have really been instrumental to me seeing like, oh, I may live in my body, but I may not be aware of what it's doing.
I think it's so much easier for us as clinicians to point out in other people.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Literally every time I have an injury, I go see a colleague and they can tell me things that I couldn't observe about my own body. And I have really come to realize that it's just better when it's a conversation with another person because we can't see everything about ourselves and it is nice to be helped. And it's not like we should or even could know everything about our own bodies and how they work. And I think that my yoga background in particular has sort of percolated through the understanding that like in yoga, there's a concept of the koshas, like that you have a physical body and you have an energy body and a mental body and an emotional body and some others that I can't remember, but all of them are kind of like layers of our experience and they're all playing into things. And once I moved into the abdomen and the pelvis, that became really like, oh, that's how yoga talks about this. And I'm definitely seeing it even in the Western model that all of those things are at play. And it's not just, popsicle sticks, like just a purely physical entity, there's like a lot of energy and emotional experience and other stuff that's really influencing that picture.
Yeah. I actually had an interesting experience just on Friday, just the other day, where my daughter woke up in screaming pain in the middle of the night. And, as a physical therapist who's worked with 6-year-olds screaming in a hospital, I'm like, this is probably fine. But also, you shouldn't just be screaming in pain in the middle of the night. So she slept in our bed for the rest of the night. And when we got up in the morning, she was like, I can't walk. And I was like, no big deal. I will pick you up and put you on the toilet. And just that transfer
Yeah.
to the toilet so that she could pee in the morning, micro movements of her leg were so painful that I was like, we probably should go to the hospital. Like, this is probably not something that I'm just going to be able to help you with.
Yeah.
And in the hospital, I've seen this over and over and over again. The nervous system is so heightened, so on high alert. There's muscle guarding that everything feels impossible. There's IV attempts that don't work. And there's, it's like, it just sort of snowballs on it. It was so hard. And I think also for her not understanding why she was having pain and me I didn't know why either. Right. So not being able to explain that. And as soon as there was sort of an answer and we knew that she was going to be okay.
Yeah.
She still couldn't put weight on her leg, but she was way more willing to try. And she ended up, just because I am who I am, I asked them to give me crutches, and we had been there for 10 hours and they were thinking of keeping her overnight. And I was like, just give me the crutches and we'll go home. They kept telling me, it's really hard to coordinate crutches when you're a kid. And I was like, I've got this. It's okay.
Yeah.
But I think just being at home, back away from a space that was heightening her nervous system, made a huge difference. So anyway, that was a tangent, but
good.
So I'm curious, you are currently doing this deep dive with Diane Lee. What has that brought up for you? And I guess maybe tell us a little bit about Diane Lee. What has that brought up for you about how we understand the abdominal wall, the pelvis, and the trunk as a whole system?
Yeah, totally. First of all, she's just an incredible clinician who's been practicing for 50 years and is still curious and can laugh about the things that we used to believe in the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s and all that stuff. So it's just really inspiring to be around someone who has been willing to learn and shed as the process and has not felt a need to be like stuck in their authority. So that's just cool to be around. She was really involved in the early, I
was going to say, before you go on, for people who are listening who maybe weren't even born in the 80s, what were we doing that was laughable in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s?
Yeah, in the 80s especially, there was a lot of skilled physical therapists who were doing like joint manipulations and then sending the patient home with zero modifications to what they did at home. Maybe not even a home program. It was really manually based with like a pretty sophisticated understanding of like how the joint surfaces determine joint movement, but it was a lot about the passive structures of the body, like the joint capsules. So that was kind of a thing. Like, for example, I have a mentor who is one of the first pelvic practitioners in Portland, and they used to just stick a biofeedback probe into someone's vagina and then never touch the muscles and never have any sense of what was going on in there, and then just hope that the biofeedback probe would be enough. And that was it. That was the one treatment. So things have really evolved. Diane Lee was involved in the research that Paul Hodges conducted and some other folks like Linda Joy Lee, who looked at what do we understand about the rib cage? And these, this is my hand gesture to represent the individual rings, because the nerves to the abdominal muscles run in between the ribs and down into the abdomen, spiraling down into the abdomen and pelvis. So if you've got some funky upper back alignment, that can actually dictate your abdominal wall function. So there's a lot of knock-on effects from that, right? Because most of us get pretty stiff through our thorax and our rib cage during pregnancy. And she was involved in the research on the TA, which is the deepest layer of the abdominals with Paul Hodges. And so they especially with the early research on diastasis, we used to think, oh my gosh, we've just got to make this distance smaller. And she was involved in the research that went from this idea of like, oh, let's use our hands to push, it's apart, let's push it together, it just must be together as soon as possible. She was involved in the research that really debunked that, and that showed that the way that the TA helps rehabilitate diastasis is because if you don't load a structure, it actually gets weaker. So muscle, the human body is alive. So this concept that like you could take two popsicle sticks and just put them next to each other and that's good is not how human bodies work. We're so much more like plants, You got to give them the right amount of sun. the right amount of water. If they don't like that soil, you've got to shift that up, and they will respond to these inputs because they're living.
What have you noticed in terms of, we were just starting to poke into this, that like we're talking about not just pelvic floor, but the rib cage. We're talking about the abdominal wall. So the pelvic floor just isn't an isolated thing. It's really responding to what's happening above and below. Can you kind of break down what that means to you clinically and what you see in your clients?
Yeah. Well, for example, one of the things that's cool about Diane's, what she's teaching these days is knowing. So the pelvis is the bony structure, the bony ring in the center of the whole skeleton. So of necessity, sort of because of gravity and because of physics, it's going to have to cope with what it's carrying on top and what the structures are that support it. Sometimes I think of it as being like the trolley of drinks on the airplane. So it's like the table of the trolley, and then the legs are like the legs and the wheels of the trolley. And then our trunk is kind of like this massive coffee urn that's on top of the trolley, right? So if the urn is doing funky stuff or is sitting on a cup and isn't straight, then the pelvis is going to have to try and get under that and support it. But also if, they put a wheel up on like the little side border strip, then the trolley's not straight. And so then, it's trying to make stability. The pelvis as a bony unit is the center of the whole skeleton. And then the pelvic floor, although it has some specific hats that it wears specific to like pelvic organ function, it's the core at the bottom of the bony ring that is in the center of the skeleton, and it's attached to our hip muscles. So it's the tensioning system in the center of the body. And so her work really tries to look at, okay, we need to take the whole body into account, because, for example, if someone had a bunch of concussions, chances are actually right at the top of the system, there may be some unfriendly inputs to the whole nervous system tone. Like the vagus nerve is a cranial nerve. It's starting to like really get its day in the sun lately, but it's coming out of the skull. And so if we have weird stuff going on with our skull placement, potentially we have some influences coming from the very top of the system that you might not think to look at, because, typically we feel pain, we look where the pain is. We don't think, okay, what might be driving this? And then at the foot, if you have some stiffness in your midfoot, you're not going to be able to pronate. You're not going to be able to get your glutes fully functioning. Your knee is going to be sad. All of that is the legs of the trolley that's underneath the pelvis. So her work is really trying to look at how would I scan through the whole body really quickly, and we'll notice lots of different things if you've been living in your body. Like there's going to be multiple findings. No one has a symmetric body or perfect motor control. And how do we assess which thing seems to be the most driving all the other things and which things seem to be responding to that driver, so that we can intervene efficiently in the first place that seems to be having the biggest effect on the whole? I feel like I got a little into the weeds there. Help me.
Yeah, well, I think what's interesting is this happens a lot, actually, I think, for patients where they come in and they're like, this hurts. And if they're working with someone who's really attuned to the body, they might be like, I think it's coming from here. So what is it about, for example, or wherever you end up going that lights it up for you, that makes you really think as a clinician, like, I think this is where it's coming from?
Yeah, well, one piece of it is just seeing how short that part might be falling from participating well. Like if we can see someone really lacks hip mobility in a certain direction or plane, and it's pretty substantial, then we're curious about it. And then often what we'll do now is to try and sort of use outside supports to help that body part participate better, and just see if it makes a difference or not. And then we can quickly kind of, cross things off the list. Like, okay, we gave you some artificial sacroiliac joint stability. Did that help a lot, or did that not make a difference? Okay, moving on. If we change your hip participation, did that help your shoulder pain or not? And then we kind of sort of quickly triage through, like, okay, that didn't seem like that helped you at all.
Yeah, that's great. Actually, from my own experience working with you, I have had the privilege of coming to see you quite a few times. We were talking a lot about my knee, and looking at my ankle mobility, realized that I really don't have ankle mobility that I probably need for my knee to not have to overcompensate with extra mobility. So
yes,
cool.
I feel like in the last couple of years, it has really kind of come forward for me that the knee, the low back, and the neck are almost never drivers. So the knee, the low back, and the neck are often having to respond to other body parts that should be participating more and aren't. Often drivers are like foot and ankle, hip, mid back, skull. So it's pretty interesting. So, your knee is really stuck between your ankle and your hip. And if it has bad neighbors, it's going to suffer,
Yeah, it's hard to live with bad neighbors.
Deadbeats not pulling their weight,
Well, let's talk about what happens when the pelvic floor tries to overcompensate for something that's not going well above or below, like the TA, transversus abdominis, for those of you who don't know TA.
Yeah, totally. I was joking before when I said, like deadbeats or bad neighbors, because really the whole body is always trying to help us. So that was a joke. And we can thank those overactive body parts for trying to give us what is needed, and not maybe can't perceive that they can't do it by themselves. So for those of you who've read Harry Potter, the pelvis, we can kind of think of it as being like the monster book of monsters or whatever it's called. So the pelvis, although it's this broad ring-like structure, we can think of the two sides of it as being like the covers of just a really thick book. And if the TA is underactive, then we don't close the book. If the deep abdominals don't provide stability between our two front hip bones, then it's really hard to get that book closed. And then everything that we do, it's like we're acting with, we put the book down open, and then there's a lot of creasing and pressure in the back at the sacroiliac joints. So if we're missing that front body stability, our bodies are going to find it somewhere else. So frequently, especially in the postpartum crowd, we're getting that stability from the back of our pelvic floor that attaches to the tailbone. And of course, it's holding hands with our deep hip muscles that then attach to our outer hip bones. So a really common stability pattern is that the back of the pelvic floor and those hip muscles are creating stability by clipping in and tucking our tail under. And that does give us some stability, but it locks down our hip joints, which we really, really need. And the price that we pay is often that the sacroiliac joints are hurting and the low back is hurting because they're now having to pick up the slack for the hip joints. The hip joints should actually have a tremendous amount of mobility because they're a ball and socket joint. And so that's a stability pattern that comes with a really high price. But it's hard to persuade the pelvic floor to not lock down, especially the posterior pelvic floor, if we don't have a viable alternative.
Yeah.
I need to tell you guys about the Cerise Chill because it absolutely changed the way that I feel about pumping. First of all, it's so slick. It's basically a cooler that you pump into. It has all these different parts that fit together to form different cups, and then it all fits back together to keep your milk cold forever. I took 4 of these things with me across the country, and it kept my milk absolutely cold and actually started freezing it. So the Cerise Chill, I'm not even going to say more. You should just go check it out. There's a link in the show notes if you want to learn more.
So what sorts of things would you tell someone who comes in with that? Because that's such a common pattern. You've got the glutes kind of tucked under, adductors are so tight, obliques trying to kind of help, but transversus abdominis and rectus obviously is not helping. So just a little quick anatomy lesson for those of you listening. Transversus abdominis is the deepest layer, and it's horizontal fibers. So they're running like rings around you, and they go all the way around your back. And you also then have your obliques, which go in diagonal directions. Internal and external have opposite diagonals. And then you have the rectus abdominis, which is the most superficial, so the closest to the surface, and its fiber direction is up and down. And so in pregnancy, that especially gets stretched. And if you've heard of diastasis, that is the separation of the center line of the rectus abdominis, so those up and down fibers. And that's a certain amount of that is expected in pregnancy, but not necessarily something that you want to ignore. So I know, Laura, you had a really severe diastasis. So if you're willing, I would love to talk to you about that at some point.
Yeah, okay.
But so there's our little orientation to the abdominal muscles. What sorts of things do you tell somebody who has that pattern who walks through your doors? And I mean, this is impossible because every single body that walks through your doors is different. If there's any little common threads.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you said that everyone's unique, because it is true that everyone's body presents differently. But that is actually one of the most common patterns. It's not just in pregnancy, although it is almost inevitable after a pregnancy, it feels like. But I have a lot of male patients with that pattern right now as well. So they've obviously never gestated a human, but we don't live in a culture where our hips move. And so we come by it pretty honestly. Like if you never it's like a use it or lose it thing. We don't live in a culture where people sit down in a deep squat to have conversations, or, the hip really never gets past 90 degrees. So anyway, I see it in bodies that haven't had pregnancies, although it's very common postnatally. We start working on just helping the hip muscles allow movement. And we start working on how do you use your hips functionally so that, especially those of us who have children, we have smaller bandwidth potentially than we used to have for just kind of noodling around and taking care of our own bodies. So we need to, unless we want to be spending a huge chunk of our day doing rehab, if we can just learn how to access movement in our ordinary life, then we're not having to set extra time aside, and we're using in our body in a way that's balancing and nutritious, rather than, please take my children so that I can now do 3 hours of self-care, because that's just not feasible for most people. So we start working on, okay, how are your hip muscles stuck? How do we re-educate them to start to own their whole range of motion? And then how do we then use our hips in a way that keeps using that range of motion? And how do we perceive the tension in the back of the pelvic floor? And how do we learn to talk to those muscles sort of throughout our days? Yeah, really just figuring out how to scaffold those things into the way that we use our body anyway, because anyone who has tiny humans is going to be doing a lot of bending. So we can either do that in a way that helps create more balance through our pelvis, or we can do that in a way that sort of perpetuates the worn out pattern that is causing dysfunction. Did that answer that?
Yeah. You know what this brought up for me is I often say that pregnancy is a portal to better health. Honestly, one thing that I hadn't thought about until right now is that, yes, in pregnancy, there's so much opportunity for change in the body. And there's this ability to think like, okay, I need to take care of myself, not just for me, but for this little human. And you you can make new habits that you can take with you postpartum. But one thing that I didn't even think about was that, like, yeah, you're going to be on the ground more than normal.
Yeah.
And why not use that to your advantage?
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's a blessing that lots of people may not have access to if they never are around tiny people. Like their body may stay chair shaped their whole life. You're right.
It's funny because we're talking right now and the computer is sitting on my chair and I'm on the floor.
That is hilarious. Nice.
And it's not for any other reason except that this is where I like to be. So, and I think that's probably just years and years of doing this.
Right.
And having this be a more comfortable and interesting position, and, having one leg bent and one leg straight and then switching sides, and just, that variety. That we look for so often, even just as a pediatric physical therapist, as I'm looking at a baby developing, but also in the pregnant body and postpartum body, as we're looking for ways to move in a way that you're not used to moving because your body is already in that pattern. So, yeah.
Could not agree more. I'm really preoccupied with diversity of movement strategies, diversity of, actions, body positions. It's like, I was speaking once to this somatic psychotherapist, and I asked her what she wished that pelvic floor PTs would know. And I was not prepared for how mind blown I was going to be by her answer. But she said, just remember that the process of growing up, the process of becoming an adult, for many people is a long, slow process of learning to ignore your own body and your own needs. Like, to be a good child is to be a child who sits still. To be a good child is to eat when other people tell you to. And what other people tell you to, and to go to bed when they want you to, and to wake up when they want you. So like the process of growing up in some ways, like to become an adult, like, yes, we need discipline, and yes, we need to be able to participate in society and consider other people. But the price for the way that most of us have been trained to do that is pretty high. Like this like being divorced from our own intuition and our own looking inside for what the body's asking for is pretty pervasive. And I was so mind blown. I was just sort of sitting there like, I'm just going to be gripping the edge of the table for the next 20 minutes. Just bear with me while I recalibrate, as both a parent and as a person in a body myself who's trying to get back to feeling, like, what is it that my body is needing from me? So yeah, like more we can, I think, being parents as well, we can learn from our children. Like, my body needs to wiggle right now, or I need to get up, or now I need to climb something, or now I need to jump, or now I'm really tired and I'm going to lay down and I need a hug. Diversity! Let's be less.
Yeah, wow. I similarly feel, in a conversation that I had just a couple of weeks ago, we talked about how a lot of, having your period is learning to ignore your body. But this just sort of expands that to no, it's not just throughout your teenagehood that you're being taught to ignore your body. You're actually being taught from a very young age. And you may have just changed the way that I parent.
I mean, hopefully we're all evolving all the time. But it's such it's in contrast with this idea that we do need to help our children like develop some patience and some tolerance. It's such an interesting, I think it's more useful when we view these sort of challenges to our previously held beliefs as like an exciting point of curiosity that we can explore instead of the old paradigm was bad, let's move to the new paradigm. But it is really pretty trippy, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, okay. Let's go back to the body, and specifically, let's talk about the feet and ankles. We touched on this with my special ankles, but how do you feel like the feet and ankles influence pelvic floor function in ways that people might not expect?
Yeah, profoundly. I had a French patient once, and France is sort of considered like the more enlightened place when it comes to pelvic rehab because people are just given re-education visits after a pregnancy and birth. You don't have to have a symptom. They're like, you produced a human. That's a big deal. Please help your body re-educate to what it needs. So I was talking to my French patient whose mother was simultaneously doing rehab in France in her menopausal years. And they had her, she was like, her mother asked her, are you on a bûche yet? Which is the French word for log. And my patient was like, what do you mean? And I think it turned out it was like a half foam roller, but made out of wood. And so they did it on the unstable side and they were having her balance on it. And I thought, oh, yeah, because they've done studies which show that when you're barefoot and you have more sensory data coming from the sole of your foot, your pelvic floor is more active. Just like they've done studies that show that when you grip an object more firmly, your rotator cuff will activate. So it's like when we grip something in our hand, the nervous system is so intelligent that it says, well, if you're holding something that firmly in your hand, probably your shoulder needs to be alert right now. So when we're getting data from our feet, the pelvic floor is like, oh, incoming from below, so that's just a sensory piece of it. Feet get pretty ignored in Western culture as well. So that there's a lot of reasons that we may not be perceiving much through our feet. And then, we don't use our feet just like we don't use our hips in a really diverse range of ways. Our feet don't get used in a diverse range of ways most of the time. And so often there's a combination of stiffness through the joints of the foot. It actually has many, many joints, the foot and ankle, and weakness. So then we're like, okay, I want to go for a run. But it's like if we were a ghost that didn't have feet, you're like trying to run without feet, right? If they're not participating, then they're really not contributing, whether it's because of stiffness or weakness. So the pattern that the shape of the foot is used to being in will dictate the rotation of the hip joint, which then sort of dictates how the hip can contribute. Yeah, weakness patterns from just our society or from previous injuries like ankle sprains, surgeries. I can't tell you how often I get someone's socks off and I'm like, what's this scar? And they're like, oh, I had a bunionectomy. And then we look at how their muscles are functioning and our muscles remember being turned off because of injury. Like when there's swelling, when there's inflammation in an area, usually the local muscles will either go offline and become inactive or they will spasm and become inactive because of tightness. So if you don't go back and flip those muscles back on, then they aren't participating. So yeah, and as we said earlier, there's some interesting biomechanical work lately that shows that if we can't pronate through our foot, which people used to really malign and badmouth pronation as like, oh, it's causing all these problems. But if we can't access the inner edge of our foot flattening out, then we can't access full glute function. And we won't get full ankle mobility either, because there's a combination of movements that need to occur in order for our ankle to move well. So if the ankles don't move well, they're not absorbing shock. And then all the joints above are having to absorb more. So that can lead to more pressure on the pelvic organ. There's just a myriad of ways that they're intertwined,
Incredible. What do you think about as a physical therapist, as somebody who works really closely with the pelvic floor and the importance of the feet? What do you think about barefoot shoes that's kind of coming up? And, there is some importance to being barefoot. I think of the marketing and all of that around barefoot shoes.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of when people will market something as a glute exercise. It might be an exercise that's supposed to be for your glutes, but if your glutes are disadvantaged in some way, either because the hip joint doesn't move through its full range or because your body prefers to use other muscles due to old patterns, you can be doing a quote unquote glute exercise and it will never touch your glutes, right? So if a muscle is inhibited or otherwise disadvantaged, it's going to be hard for it to participate even with our best intentions. So having a really individualized assessment of, okay, I'm doing something that I hope will help me. Is it doing something new for me or not? And I think that this is pretty analogous to what happened with the barefoot shoe movement. I think there was actually a class action against Vibram because people were like, I started wearing these barefoot shoes in my 40s and why didn't it fix my health? Why do I have pain? So if we have feet that are either stiff or inhibited muscularly, wearing something that sort of asks the foot to do more might help, and it might reveal what we're missing. You know, we can't just wish that our feet muscles would participate or that muscles that support our ankle. We might need to help them learn how to participate. So I think it's a good awareness to have. And sometimes people need to build up to that. Any abrupt changes that are just whole cloth, like, and now I clench my core all the time, or, and now I only wear barefoot shoes. The body's like, whoa, we need to build up to that gradually. So can be helpful, might need individual assessment.
I mean, it's so easy for the body to compensate and kind of use the patterns that it's been using, even if it's put in, you know, one of the things about barefoot shoes, I think, is that there's a zero drop, meaning a lot of our shoes have a little bit of a heel to them, which makes it so that we don't actually need full dorsiflexion. We don't need that full range of our leg coming forward and our foot getting bent up, or toe getting bent up towards the knee. So when we think about a barefoot shoe, it's making you do that. Your calves are going to really be working maybe harder than they have been. But at the same time, you have the whole rest of your body and all the joints that are stacked on top of it sort of being like, whoa, what are we doing? This is different.
Yeah, totally. I think about that all the time. Like, why is it that when we're trying to do something new, the body's like, let me just use this old pattern? And one of my guesses is that, you know, it's cost intensive. It's expensive to the brain and the body to have to learn a new movement pattern. It's annoying. It's cumbersome. Like, what if we had to learn to walk every day? Like, that's inefficient. The body's like, you sorted that out. Here's the resources that we have. Let's just go. I don't feel like doing that whole thing again. No, that's my guess. I don't know.
So true.
If you are looking for a pacifier that will support your baby's oral motor development, the Ninny is my favorite. So it's wide at the base and soft at the base, and it gets firm at the tip, just like a breast and a nipple and an areola. It's not as firm as a traditional pacifier, so it allows your baby to get used to getting organized around a softer surface. Use the code BeWellBaby for 10% off at checkout at ninnyco.com. Thanks for listening. Let's get back to the episode.
Okay, so we talked a little bit about the head, neck, and jaw, and I want to dive a little bit deeper into how those structures influence pelvic tone. And you mentioned the vagus nerve, such a hot topic these days, but how do you see those structures, the head, neck, and jaw especially, influencing pelvic tone?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is they obviously do. And anyone who's read Ina May Gaskin's work has heard her take on how we need to be mindful of jaw tension during birth and how we use our vocal folds during birth. Clinically, I've had the experience where there's one patient in particular she had birthed 2 humans vaginally, but man, her pelvic floor was really overactive, and there wasn't much that I could say that changed that and that she could try. And I have a vast library of cues to give people. So I was like, man, what are we going to do? And we were talking about tongue ties because we were just having a conversation and how both of her kids had tongue ties and she was going to have them released. And then she got herself assessed and realized that she had a tongue tie and she was going to get it released. And that sort of lit a light bulb for me. And I asked her what her experience of her own jaw was like. And she confided that, yeah, she has a lot of jaw muscle tightness. Just as a point of exploration, I asked her to really imagine melting her jaw and making space between her back teeth and all that. And what do you know? That was the only cue that made any difference to her pelvic floor tone. And it was just wild to experience directly, even though I had read Ina May's books and even though I had some awareness of it. So, I'm not sure we fully understand the mechanisms behind it, but what's happening, our brain is pretty central. The nerves coming out of the brain are pretty central. It is the top of the system. You and I have talked actually about how, from a developmental perspective, a human's first job is to be able to breathe and eat at the same time in a way, right? To be able to do that. And so I wonder if in the hierarchy of what our body prioritizes, when we experience dysfunction in that sort of most essential, can I access nourishment part of my body, that when there's something kind of off there, then the whole system feels upset.
And I mean, for that particular client, it's possible that she did have a hard time with breastfeeding, or, as an infant herself with her jaw tension and her tongue tie. I know, like, in the generation before us, breastfeeding didn't last very long because some people would go back to work and didn't even know they needed to pump. And there's just such a lack of support. And so you had a lot of babies, transitioning to formula really quickly, and or just starting on formula because it was easier. And so I think there's definitely something to be said for looking at that initial feeding relationship and thinking about it as like a sense of safety,
Yeah.
and I mean, don't get me wrong, there are really, really wonderful ways to bottle feed your baby and instill a sense of safety and nourishment and love and caring and bonding. That's not really what I'm talking about. It's that tension in the body that makes it feel difficult to ingest something that can tell your nervous system, this is hard and we should keep hanging on for dear life.
Yeah. One of my dearest friends is a pre and postnatal, like yoga and movement teacher. And that doesn't convey even a little bit how extraordinary she is as a thinker. But she will often talk to her adult folks about how when there's a lot of tension in our muscles, no matter where they are in the body, there's a two-directional relationship between the nervous system and the muscles. One is if we are stressed, the muscles will become more toned in preparation for action, whether it's fight, fleeing, fawning, whatever it is. But similarly, if we artificially or, consciously create a lot of tension in our muscles, that communicates back to the nervous system, hey, I'm in a state of preparation, not a state of rest. So yeah, maybe it's that as well, right? Like, but just like everything, there must be a resting phase if there's a working phase. And if we have a body part that's having trouble accessing resting, it's sort of setting the tone of should anyone else in the body rest, or are we on high alert and we need to stay alert and we can't access softness? I think we're so lucky that we live in this generation that has all these insights about how much the human nervous system cares about a sense of safety, and how much in a human nervous system safety is quite relational. So we're lucky, but it's still evolving, isn't it?
My gosh, yeah. And it's still, really frequent that I see clients who have absolutely no connection with their pelvic floor. And this is the first time that they're sort of in this part of their body that they're like, oh gosh, like a human has to come out of here, first of all. And then second of all, I have to continue doing all these bodily functions that are now scary because this human came out of there. Or they're dealing with a C-section scar, and there's just so much layered in there. So I'm curious, what is your go-to way to help somebody feel connected to their pelvic floor? And it's so easy as a client to think pelvic floor, this is over here, and then my body is over here. So how do you integrate that into the whole system and help people kind of see their pelvic floor as part of that system?
Yeah. I mean, everyone learns differently. So one of our jobs is to figure out what style of learning is going to help this person the most. So I have as I mentioned, a really vast repertoire of verbal cues that I'll give people. So try to, if your body was a 50-story building and your pelvic floor is the elevator, are you finding it up at your hairline, or are you finding it at your feet? Like, where, if you imagine this sort of top to bottom spatial presence of the pelvic floor and the openings through it, can you perceive that? And sometimes the answer is no, cannot perceive. So then often we'll move on to tactile cueing. So if you've ever had someone come up behind you and squeeze your shoulders, you may have thought, man, I didn't realize those muscles were so tight. So touch is a really rich form of sensory information. And so we can use objects, or we can use hands, we can use other ways of helping people to perceive what their muscles are doing. I think it's kind of like a fish don't know they're wet kind of a thing. So if your pelvic floor is used to doing whatever it's doing, it's not going to say, I'm doing something unusual, because it's doing what it usually does, and it's not going to let you know. It doesn't know. So often we have to kind of start in a more isolated way of, can I just locate those muscles with my mind? Can I perceive them in my sensory map of my body? And it's like learning the alphabet, I think. First, you got to actually know the alphabet, and then you have to be able to produce those letters with your fingers. And then we can start getting fancy and sounding words out, and then we can write sentences, and then we can write novels. So there is a little bit of this, like any new skill, you have to kind of drill and rehearse the early stages when we're in that procedural stage of learning that is so mentally exhausting. And then we start trying to, once we have that ease of accessing that information, then we can start to get into a more complicated thing, like a warrior two, or like lifting a kid, and then ask our body, does it feel like the amount of tension in this moment is the just right amount? And can I experiment, like again, treating it more as a point of curiosity than a correction? Can I experiment with, what if I did less with my anus right now, for example? Does this movement feel better, worse, or the same? What if I did more with the front of my pelvic floor? Does this movement feel better, worse, or the same? And then knowing that those muscles are really on a dimmer switch, not full bore floodlights or completely dark, totally off, So it isn't the easiest. It really is, I think, a practice that probably is beneficial to have for our whole lives, because our muscles are always responding to new circumstances or different changing circumstances. It's not like, okay, I checked on my pelvic floor, checked that box, moving on,
It's a lifelong journey.
Indeed.
And what's interesting is we tend to pay closer attention in those moments of transition, like pregnancy, postpartum, perimenopause, menopause.
Yeah.
But it's not something that we shouldn't be paying attention to all the time.
Yeah. And that's an interesting one as parents too, that we can try to maybe guide our kids into noticing what their bodies are feeling and experiencing in different moments,
My gosh. Yeah. Like we have this incredible opportunity to teach our next generation about their pelvic floor as almost like a nervous system clue.
Yeah.
And
Totally.
be able to say, like, what's your anus doing right now?
Yes. I'm here for that.
Gosh. I love all of your metaphors. It's just very helpful to have this visual. You have mentioned a couple of your cues, like the trolley and the airplane. And I'm really curious about when you're trying to kind of retrain somebody's pelvic floor, what is maybe the most common cue that you use to help somebody relax, or even help somebody find their pelvic floor? So that person who you're asking them about the elevator and they're like, nope, there's no elevator. What is one of the most common things that you see that you can use to help somebody find that area of their body and be able to engage it, relax it, and just start the process of bringing awareness?
Yeah. There's kind of a debate in the pelvic rehab world that hopefully is not so present anymore, but of, oh, if you're tight, you mustn't do contractions. Oh, if you're weak, you have to do a lot of contractions. Like you're in two different categories, but tight muscles are often not signaling well either. So sometimes actually just giving people cues to contract different parts of their pelvic floor or to find tensioning helps them locate those muscles, and then they can relax better. So sometimes actually just taking someone through a series of cues, like, can I go for it? One of the most ridiculous ones is, those claw machines in the lobby of a Fred Meyer, where you can use a claw to pick up a stuffy and then try to retrieve it. So if you imagine that your anus is the claw, obviously, could you grab a blueberry with your anal claw and lift it up to your head and hold the blueberry at your head for 5 seconds? Hold it up, don't let go. You want to keep the stuffy, your blueberry. And then could you lower the claw down? And then, of course, if you want to release the blueberry or your stuffy, you're going to have to let the claw open. So can we feel any of those actions? So, and then I have cues for other parts of the pelvic floor as well. So often we'll try out a bunch of contraction cues, because that process of trying those things will often just help the brain locate muscles. But again, sometimes if we put our bodies in a certain position, we're more likely to create movement through a certain part of the pelvic floor. Like, so there's certain yoga postures that will often make it easier to get movement through the pelvic floor, like a happy baby or a supported deep squat or things like that. So sometimes we'll try those. But also, again, if someone really can't feel it, tactile information is really valuable. And so using touch can be super valuable. We can have someone touch the tip of their own tailbone, their coccyx, or touch their own perineum, or if they need us to do some of the tactile input, we can do that as well. So that's probably just because of the way that we practice, that's one of the most helpful tools that we have.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, that's amazing. And I really hope that everyone comes away from this conversation practicing their anal claw.
Make sure you release the blueberry. It's important.
Have to release it. Or the stuffy, whatever you imagine that you retrieved with your claw.
What goes up must come down.
I guess my last question is just, what do you hope that people walk away from this conversation knowing?
I hope that we all move towards a sense of curiosity. When we have pain or incontinence or dysfunction, there can be a lot of fear, understandably, and a lot of sense of like, I should have known better. Like, how did I wind up in this situation? And I hope that we can all move towards knowing that you can't know everything and that we learn with other people often, and that if something's going on that we can't shift ourselves, there are resources, there are humans who can probably help us see things about how our body's functioning that maybe we can't see the whole picture of because we're inside the body. And that none of it is irretrievable usually. And that the body's so much less, what's the word that I'm looking for? I think we often have a sense that either it's working perfectly or it's busted. And if it's busted, it's going to have to be put back together. And maybe it can and maybe it can't. But what's wild about human bodies is that they really want to do what they're supposed to do. And they might just be missing the inputs. It's like having a plant in the wrong soil. The plant's like, I'm trying to grow, but this is clay and I need sand, help. So, I have almost killed several of my houseplants, and I'm happy to report that most of them, once I figured out what it was that they were missing and they needed, they were able to come back because they really wanted to come back. It seems like, if I can anthropomorphize plants. So it's often there's so much that isn't really just, is it broken or is it fine? It's just, is it thriving and what might it need to thrive? And that's pretty exciting, actually.
And that our bodies want to thrive.
Yeah, it seems that way to me anyway.
What's your current curiosity?
I'm really interested in, with each part of the body, how do we give it its most diverse and capable set of tools? And I feel like I've made a lot of progress on the foot and the hip and the pelvic floor, but there's still lots of the body to cover. And just I'm really curious about, just scaffolding that knowledge outward through the rest of the body. Like the relationship of the parts to each other is kind of still where I'm finding a lot of excitement. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Laura, so much for your time. This was an amazing conversation, and I know that everyone's going to get a lot out of it.
Yay! Fun talking to you.
Yeah, you too.
Laura just gave us so much today, but I think the thing that's going to stick with me is that realization about how we're teaching our kids from a really young age to ignore their bodies. And if that's happening to them, it's happening to us too. So maybe the work isn't just about your pelvic floor or your ankle or your jaw. Maybe it's about remembering how to listen to what your body is actually asking for. If you are dealing with pelvic floor stuff, pain, dysfunction, or if you just want to move differently, get curious about it, not scared of it, and know that any leaking, any pain, none of that is ever something that you need to live with. There are so many options out there for treatment, and your body wants to work. It might just need something that you haven't thought to give it yet. Laura's work is incredible, and if you are in Portland, Oregon, I highly recommend finding her or her lovely business partner, Abby. They are both wonderful at Mount Tabor Pelvic Health. The links are in the show notes. Thank you so much for being here. Next up, there's an episode where I just tear apart this New York Times article about an intervention that is used in birth so commonly, it will blow your mind. This New York Times article just dropped, and it was just incredible timing, so I had to bring it to you in these first 5 episodes. If you're enjoying this podcast, please send it to someone who needs to remember that their body is trying to help them. Send it to someone you love. Send it to someone who needs to hear it. And remember, you're not alone in this. Thanks for being here. See you next time.
New episodes drop every Wednesday, and you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Follow me on Instagram at BeWellBabyPDX or just visit BeWellBaby.org. Send an episode to someone who's pregnant, postpartum, or just needs guidance. No one should have to do this alone. Welcome to the Be Well Baby podcast. You're in the right place.